Roxy Thorne to you. Roxy is a professor both in landscape architecture and architecture at the U of O. She teaches courses in urban design, microclimate design, and design studios that bridge the two disciplines. She's worked for architectural firms in Boston, Charlottesville, and in Philadelphia. And she has professional experience in gray fields development, urban design, and housing at a variety of scales. She also is a member of the Sustainable Sites Initiative from the U of O. Her work explores the reciprocity of community identity and physical environment. Her work analyzes the site's physical, ecological, and cultural structure to inform the design of spaces and places that express and enhance the lives of residents, but also perform ecologically and respond to the changing demands of communities over time. Thorne's current research includes a study of the architectural potential of landscape analysis through contemporary Icelandic studies. Roxy's a Fulbright Scholar, recipient of scholarly and design awards, including the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture Paper of the Year Award, design awards from the American Society of Landscape Architects, and the Council of Landscape Architectural Registration Board. Please join me in welcoming Roxy Thorne and her presentation, Performance and Provocation. I'm going to let you say that.
Thank you, Liska, and thank you, Colin, for this fun class and for inviting me up here. I should mention that that's the Sustainable Cities Initiative, and if you're not familiar with that, it's a new initiative at the UO doing design, urban design consulting for cities, primarily in Oregon right now, but it's a good chance to get involved with outreach and with urban design, so if you're interested, contact me or Robert Young or Nico Larco or look me up. I'm going to talk today about vegetated architecture, green roofs and green walls. And the title of the talk was Performance and Provocation. I wasn't quite sure who the audience would be here. I know we have some artists and some landscape architects. I know there's a big population of architects at the White Stag. So half the talk is really about performance and the actual technical characteristics of green roofs and green walls. And the other half is about, what you do with them and why you do them, and some of the provocative effects of vegetated architecture. So I'm going to start with a couple of quotes, and I'll return to these at the end of the talk. Two short sentences by two authors of whom I'm very fond. Beth Meyer, who is a landscape architectural historian and theorist, who says, defining the site is a creative act undertaken by an architect or a landscape architect during the early process of design. And so one of the things I'm talking about in this presentation is the physical place in which you're making things, art, buildings, landscapes, but also what are those things about? So there's both the physical site, but also the content site. And the second quote is Mi-Wan Kwan saying, this persistent, perhaps secret adherence to the actuality of places in memory or in longing is not necessarily a lack of theoretical sophistication, but a means for survival. And I'll come back to what she's talking about there. But basically, it's place specificity and the interest in and desire for regional identities, regional specificity, and the use of materials, forms, and regional historic stories in cultural production, buildings, landscapes, art. And this will, again, I'll come back to these quotes at the end. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how do green roofs perform as a technical object, as a piece of architecture, a layer of architecture, but also as a layer of landscape architecture. Three examples here: rag flats in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, by the term onion flats, kind of standard-looking suburban lawn, except that it's 2 stories up in the air in a downtown neighborhood of Philadelphia. The Life Expression Wellness Center in Sugarloaf, Pennsylvania, which has steeply sloping, zero-maintenance green roof, and so oftentimes you're told you can't do slopes on green roofs. That's not true. And then the Oakland Branch Library in Evansville, Indiana. This one's really peculiar. It's native prairie. The building's set into the hillside, and so this native prairie covers most of the building with the exception of that small piece you see sticking up. They actually do controlled burns on the roof of the library. And you can imagine the first year they did that, how excited the fire department was about that. But as many of you know, controlled burns are part of the way of maintaining a prairie ecosystem. It both kills invasive species and also activates some of the seeds of the native plants. So it's really important for the ecosystem. But the idea of integrating controlled burns and architecture, again, doesn't make your fire chief very happy. So 2 kinds of green roofs, and what you're seeing here on the left are what's known as, get the terminology straight, extensive green roofs, which are to say a thin layer of vegetation, fairly low maintenance. The one on the right, the library, is an intensive green roof, thicker layer of soil, larger plants, although this is still a pretty small end of the scale, and much higher maintenance. So those are the 2 primary divisions between green roofs, extensive and intensive. And I think there's a couple of comments here about what separates the 2. There's a lot of fuzzy ground in between, but the thing you need to know, first of all, is do people get to come up here? If yes, it's probably an intensive green roof. And how much maintenance do I want to deal with? It sounds a little perverse to talk about watering your roof, but if you're dealing with intensive green roofs, you're dealing with irrigation regimes. So you have to address all those things early on. You also have to know how much the roof weighs, and this is where green roofs are something that really require interdisciplinary collaboration. Most landscape architects aren't used to talking to a structural engineer about how much their landscape weighs. If you're doing green roofs, you need to, and the architect is going to be a good sort of translation point between the 2 disciplines of structural engineer and landscape architect. So the extensive green roof, pretty thin profile. Some sedums can grow in as little as 1 to 2 inches of growth medium. More typically, it's 4 to 6 inches. Very little public access. There's really only maintenance access. Very little maintenance required. Very little irrigation or, say, weeding or trimming of the plants. And the plant palette is primarily sedums, which are small, low-growing succulents. You get into intensive green roofs, and you can have as much as 3 or 4 feet of growth medium, typically of public access, recreation uses of these roofs. They're very high maintenance. They often require watering, mowing, pruning, weeding, the sort of general requirements of the landscape. And you get a wide variety of plants, including shrubs and trees. And I won't get into some of the technical structural issues of trees, but they're kind of a funny case. Very briefly, the components of a green roof start with the building itself, whether that's an underground parking garage or an above-ground house or museum. There's the waterproofing layer, which is, again, a standard building layer. Up to this point, we're basically typical construction. Some of the newer waterproofing systems include a leak detection system, which is basically a mesh of wires. And if a leak gets applied underneath the waterproofing, if a leak occurs, you can pinpoint and an alarm goes off. And you know exactly where the leak has happened. Obviously, expensive and more in use for things like museums, where what's underneath is high value and you want to be able to locate the leaks. So your waterproofing needs to be really good, because once you've got that in place, you start putting stuff on top of it. And if it does fail, you have a lot to remove. So the next layer is drainage. There's a lot of expensive, fancy products out there. I'm showing you one from Hydrotech. It's a sort of dimpled plastic board, lightweight, has some water storage capacity. The perforations are actually on top of the egg crate, not at the bottom. Usually those also include filter fabric above them so that the soil, the growth medium isn't washing away. But they can also be fairly simple. Most early green rooms, the drainage layer was just gravel. and then you put a layer of filter fabric over that, and then growth medium. So gravel has a lot of void in it, and it allows water to move. Recently, they've been using expanded shale, pumice, expanded clay, whatever's local and lightweight and has a lot of water movement capacity. Typically, you put filter fabric between that and growth medium. Don't put dirt on your roofs. It's really expensive or really heavy when it gets wet. So the primary component of growth medium is pumice or expanded shale or one of these other lightweight aggregates. As much as 80% in an extensive green roof, where you're really just looking for lightweight and just a little bit of growth potential. Compost or some other form of organic is the second main ingredient, and then the third is sand. And the mix depends on what you're trying to grow up there, how deep it's going to be, what kind of structure you have underneath it. This is where you need to get your well-educated landscape architect on board, helping you figure out what plants you need, how deep does the growth medium need to be, and what are the growth requirements. And then the final layer are the plants themselves. And I've given you a range of growth medium depths and the kinds of things that grow in those. So again, from early on, what's the aesthetic I'm going for? Therefore, what's the plant architecture I'm interested in? Therefore, how deep does the growth medium have to be? Now call your structural engineer and tell him that you've got 150 pounds of dead load on your roof per square foot. He's going to be really excited. And then explain to your client that you actually want the roof to store water. They're also going to be really excited. So as you construct it, it's pretty standard construction method with the exception of that middle zone where they've got the big bag hoisted up and they're carefully, slowly spreading dirt over the roof of the Sugarloaf Wellness Center. They also have blower trucks, which they take the hose up to the roof and sort of spew this stuff around and you rake it into place. What you don't want to do is dump 3 cubic yards of dirt in one spot on a roof, because again, your structural engineer is not going to be excited. Note that the waterproofing layer, a funky, what should be orange, but is actually black. That should be bright orange Sarnafil waterproofing. But note on top of it the classic bright blue Dow styrofoam layers. Basically what they were trying to do there, and that's the Chicago City Hall green roof, they wanted to create topography on the roof. But they didn't need deep soil profiles. They didn't want to grow trees. So the way you make topography on a green roof is through layers of styrofoam stacked up like that, and then you put 2 to 4 inches of growth medium over them. So you can get landforms on a green roof, but the way to do it isn't to pile dirt, it's to stack lightweight material underneath. So you do your waterproofing, your landforms if you want them, your drainage layer, dump the soil medium, and then we're bringing the plants. Typical intensive green roof, it's going to be shrubs, trees, grasses in gallon pots, kind of a standard landscape installation plants. I always want to do it backwards. Extensive green roofs. If you're doing sedums, you can do plugs. I'll show you an image of those in a minute. Actually, if I go back, that's Ed Snodgrass at the top of his farm in Maryland. He's written a book called Green Roof Plants. You can buy plugs, which is what he's tending there, plant those by hand. Or they actually sort of shape these plants and get a bunch of cuttings and you huck them out on the roof. And they're like the cockroaches of the plant world. 2 weeks later, they've made roots and they've perked up and they're quite happy. And so this roof is actually, you can barely see it in this projection, I apologize for the quality, but there's a grid of plugs which are going to give you a little more fill more quickly, but then the whole roof has been broadcast with tiny little cuttings, and in about 2 weeks they sort of perk up and get happy. So that's the sort of quick and dirty, and I've attended 3-day seminars on getting to that point. So you got the really quick and dirty version of what goes into a green roof, how they get put together. Why would you do them? It was great. I was working on a project, and in fact, I was working on my own house, and our bank said, we need a memo about the green roof. I said, yeah, sure, what do you want to know? And said, well, what do you have to plant there? How heavy is the soil? Why do you want to do this? What's the point of a green roof? I was like, whoa, you just went from technical to like ethical. Where are we going here? And I thought, if I were putting a slate roof on my house, the bank wouldn't be calling me up saying, I need a memo telling you why you're doing this. So a lot of times you're asked, why are you doing this? You're doing it for a lot of reasons, and most of them have direct tie-in to money, which is what the bank wants to hear. So improved roof life, because the roof has been protected from UV degradation, and you minimize thermal expansion and contraction, so the material holds up. In Germany, they found 3 times the expected life of the roof, or they've hit 3 times and they're still going. So they found really good life performance of especially EPDM and PVC roofs when they get protected with a green roof. Energy conservation for both heating and cooling. It provides additional insulation, so it creates sort of thermal stability for heating and cooling. But also it tumbles the air on the roof as wind blows over the plants. It sort of gets broken up, which prevents evaporative cooling, which helps in winter keep buildings warm. Obviously, it improves the aesthetic environment. If you have an office, it's a lot nicer. Maybe not in this lurid tone, but it would be a lot nicer to look out on that than on a standard roof. Control stormwater runoff, erosion, and pollution by slowing the stormwater time of concentration. This is total landscape architect talk, so you guys, time of concentration. What that does is it helps prevent downstream surges and therefore erosion and sedimentation loads in streams. So basically, you're holding some of the water on site to let the streams do their work and then slowly releasing it back into the groundwater and stream system. As a result, it improves water quality, removes particulates, and reduces the temperature. One of the real problems of increased paving is not only pollution, but also as water travels overland on streets and on sidewalks, it gets hotter, and that's raises the temperature in streams, and that's bad for fish and other living things. Similarly, it cools and cleans the air, and also provides potential habitat for birds and pollinators. This is Ford's River Rouge plant, which at the time when it was constructed was the largest green roof in the world. Something like 13 acres. It's huge. And what they've found is that there are now birds nesting on the roof of the F-150 pickup truck factory. Not bad. And Bill McDonough, who did that project, said when he worked on the GAP project, which also has green roofs, he said, I want it to be like when a bird flies over, it's as though nothing ever got killed here. So thinking about the bird's eye view, literally. This is a project that I worked on. It's Waterfront Square in Philadelphia. One of those funny cases where you're trying to balance your own ethics and aesthetics with the money of the client and the developer who has a very specific agenda. So all these pictures are of the green roof, and obviously it looks a lot like a urban square or park, which was the intention. It's all elevated 2 or 3 floors above the ground. This is an intensive green roof. It has pretty intense plantings. It has trees. It has grasses, shrubs. You can see in the image in the top left the kind of lush planting going on. You can see curves to help build up the planting depth where we need it, and then paving where we need lower profiles. This kid's playground and water fountain, and if you can believe it, and I can't, it has a putting green. My design. But this helps explain the project a little bit. It's 6 high-rise towers in Philadelphia. Obviously, there's an intense parking need for that. Where do you put them? When you're adjacent to the river and you can't dig down, you put it in a raised parking garage. So that whole area around the middle is parking garage with green roof over it. It was a great first green roof because if it leaks, it's over cars, and it's not that big a deal. So as opposed to somebody's house or a museum. And what you see is a much thicker profile here where we've got the trees, and then we get a little bit of topography as the soil profile tapers down to get to just a grass layer. That's a really quick and dirty green roofs. Green walls. Go back to this image. The one on the left is a turf house in Iceland, so green roofs aren't anything terribly new. In the middle, green walls, also not something terribly new. That happens to be Princeton, but it could be anywhere. And then I love the one on the right, which is a park in Paris, and they've created these earth forms that kids run up and down, and those have bathrooms in them for the park. So if you go around to the other side, there are doors in the hills, sort of hobbit-like. Green walls also break into two major categories. The first is green facades, and these are basically vining or twining, climbing plants in some way. They are either rooted in the ground or on the roof, or in intermediate planting layers. So the image in the middle is a good image of what that sort of intermediate plant layer looks like, and you start to get a striping to the facade of the building. Image on the left is from a company called Green Screen, and that's a prefab panel that you attach to the building, and then the plants can use that as support structure. And then the other typical, so you've got panels, and then you have cables on the right, MFO Park in Zurich, which is a sort of typical cable structure, requires twining plants typically. And the thing to note here is that they also have an intermediate planting layer, which is happening in the top left of that image, and they've got sort of shrubs and things up there. Your plant choice on green facades is limited to either trailing or climbing vine-like plants, but there's a pretty low fertilizer and water need if you get the right plants. So these tend to be fairly low maintenance. So you've got green facades, and then you have living walls, which is the other type of green wall. These actually have some form of growth medium in them. Think of these as a green roof turned sideways. So some of them, like the one on the right, Patrick Blanc's Mur Végétal, he actually doesn't have any soil. The early versions of this were really funky. He put a PVC liner so that the building wouldn't get damaged, and then really thick building felt, and then he just stapled plants to it. Not even kidding. And then there's an irrigation, drip irrigation at the top, and water and nutrients make their way down through the building felt. And that's it. The system has gotten a little more complex over time, but early images of him up there on scaffolding with a staple gun and a pile of plants. It's pretty amusing. So these tend to be smaller, non-vine-like plants. Depending on what system you're using, Patrick Blanc always uses subtropical exotic plants or plants that grow around waterfalls, because these are the plants that can deal with finding their own nutrients out of the air, out of limited water and nutrient availability. So you look at his plant palettes, and they tend to be pretty exotic. Other systems have thicker profiles and have more normal, or let's say regional native plants. So there's a support panel or a support mat, and the plants are rooted in that modular system. Typically, you get more plant choices here because you can use pretty much anything as opposed to just vines, and they also do require more fertilizer and watering. Although Patrick Blanc likes to claim that his system, if properly installed and selected, is zero maintenance, by which he means, I think, you maintain it 4 times a year, which I guess 4 is the new 0. So components fall into 4 big categories: cables, cages, grids, and sheets, from left to right. Somebody installing a whole system of cables there to support the twining plants. Green Screen makes these crazy modular things, and they'll even make them to your own specifications, so that sort of backwards C-shaped torture armature for plants is one of the possibilities for a green facade cage system. Grids, the next one over, you can even buy these things pre-planted and just fasten them to your wall. It's pretty funky. And then sheets. This is a newer version of Patrick Blanc's system, so he now has still that thick building felt, but he has a sheet that goes in front of it with cups that actually hold the soil. So each one of those gets planted with a plant, and then there's your whole wall. Triple bottom line, a lot of the same benefits as green roofs. You get cooling and shading and evapotranspirative cooling. They can help thermally, with heat loads on a building by increasing the thermal mass and reducing air movement over the surface of the building. You get air quality improvements, and in fact there are some active green walls which have, and that's that black image, have a fan in it to actively draw air through the green wall system to remove particulates, add humidity, cool the air, and so it acts as a living filter for air. Those are more common in Germany than in the US because they're like that. They help with noise reduction. These are particularly good in urban settings. They help just sort of buffer from ambient noise. Obviously, there's an aesthetic improvement and, again, potential bird and pollinator habitat, depending on the plants you pick. So again, bam, green walls in like 10 minutes. And to the more interesting or provocative aspect of it, why? So what? What can you do with them? Where do they go? I think there are a lot of people doing green roofs and green walls purely for ecological reasons, and I think that's great, and we should all be doing them. And if we do, it'll get the price down and make our cities healthier places. This is Patrick Blanc again, working with Gautier, 2002. This was their couture wedding dress. Again, it ought to be green, not yellow, but provocative. Plants have associations with nature, obviously, which has associations with Eden, with perfection, with when you get into nature, culture and technology. The association of living things sort of spirals off into a lot of places. So, as a simple provocation, the idea of using nature as medium is kind of interesting. I'm trying to remember if it was even an exhibit at University of Oregon. I don't remember. But there's somebody who hybridizes iris as an art form and then shows photographs of the hybrid iris in a museum setting. And there's this question of, is it science? Is it art? Is it really art if it's a living thing? So the notion of using plant material as your art medium is interesting and provocative, and asks some questions about, what is art? And I assume you have more answers about that than I do. Questions about artificiality and what is real. In the end, because of the client and the demands of bank financing, this came out being a bit more expected. It was still fun to do a 2-acre green roof, but the original intention was to make a statement about the artificiality of the ground plane here. So one of the things you see immediately with this section is the garage is made out of a pretty standard, cheap, quick construction technique, which is 60 foot long by 12 foot wide precast double T's, precast concrete, post-tension double T's. So you get this marking of the building in 60-foot dimensions, which is based on the size of the car. And that has implications for what you can put on top of the building. Where are the columns? Where are the structural loads transferred? So one of the first things we wanted to do was make that underlying plane apparent. So the trees were located at the center points of the column. The third points of the double T's were left unstressed. So if you know structures, you know columns here, and you put trees right at the middle, you're more likely to break it, or you have to get a much bigger piece of structure because you've now loaded the middle instead of the ends. So this was meant to be a sort of gesture towards what lies beneath. We also knew, going back to this is a view taken from one of the towers, we knew that one of the primary uses of this plaza was going to be people looking down at it from their apartments or their condos. So we knew it was going to have a sort of graphic appearance. I thought it would be really fun to take the double T's and pull them apart a foot instead of having them butted right up to each other, and have a glass block strip between each double T. So during the day, when you're in the parking garage beneath, you get light coming in, and at night, the light of the parking garage marks the ground plane. The developers didn't go with that. But I was trying to be provocative about the artificiality of this 12 by 60 module, over which there's now cutting green, which, if you can't tell, kind of cheeses me. So the artificiality of green roof or green wall, it's a completely fake nature. which ties into this piece in the Zurich airport. I'm embarrassed to admit I don't know who the artist is on this, but the idea of the airport is something that transports people to international locations. All these 3-story cubes are filled with exotic plants, and they're in these frosted glass cubes, and you can sort of get a sense of the plant life behind it. And then they have stripes, you can see in the middle image, stripes of unfrosted glass, which identify the plant and where it's from. So they're both beautiful, but they also sort of call to raise a question about where these plants are from, what's the relationship of Zurich to these other places around the globe, and the idea of nature always is natural, not really. The suburban ideal. Just think the image on the left is so insane. The idea that you would retrofit a boring cube with terraces and bamboo and pots. And you hear Edouard Francois talk about this project, and he says basically he wanted to mitigate the ugliness of the building for the surrounding neighbors, and he also wanted to give each of the residents a little green backyard. So there's this kind of funny suburban ideal of everybody gets his or her own private green space. There's also this insane kind of hairy quality to the building. And then the quotidian lawn sort of turned on its side and reframed, questioning, what is this thing that we value in this lawn? Creating identity. Again, a similar idea here on the left, the party wall hanging green, done by the Young Architects Boston group. I think they put it up this spring. And basically pre-grown mats of plants that they then put, you can see in the top right, on hangers, on cables, string it up on the side of the building, and they were calling it zero footprint public art. And that all these blank party walls on brick buildings in Boston could become places for this hanging tapestry art. And they're really talking about placemaking and creating identity and the potential of living things to help create identity. Caixa Forum Museum in Madrid, same idea, and Patrick Blanc talks about his work often as painting with plants, about creating living tapestries. He has a very kind of artistic metaphor, and I think he sees himself as an artist, not as a landscape architect. And the work that he does is just a very, very big canvas, usually, at the scale of the building, and his medium is plant. And at what point does creating identity fade over to branding? I don't know. This is Topiad. Obviously, it's a Louis Vuitton store. Gregory Coletta and Sun Jang architects. And the idea is that there's a matrix on the building attached to what they call a very banal ugly building. And you have these little potted topiaries, and you can change it up seasonally. As with the window display, only it's the wall display. Kind of insane, and yet kind of wonderful. And then nature in the service of retail. People like green stuff. I remember a building technology class at MIT where the professor was saying, what about concrete? You know, what's good, what's bad about concrete? What about steel? What about wood? And people were like, well, wood does this, wood does that. And I was like, anything else? I think that's the checklist from the textbook. He said, you forgot the most important one. People like wood. Hold it right, people. So people like plants. I'm not sure about that fresh salads billboard, but it's provocative and it's kind of crazy. People like plants. You think McDonald's, you think greasy and fat and yucky and unhealthy. You look at that billboard and you think, oh, it's living. Things live at McDonald's. Exciting. And then you look at the Andenulmister shop in Seoul, and it's this continuous kind of glowing surface that goes into the building as well, of this turf wall. It's quite beautiful, and I know I look at it and I would just want to walk along the building and sort of touch it, and suddenly find myself in the shop, which is exactly what they want me to do. And then perception of place. This is funny. I actually thought the image in the top left, that's a photograph I took of the 21st Century Museum of Contemporary Art. I thought that was designed by the architects, the green wall, and I've been trying to find, other images of it, better images of it, and nobody else has pictures of it, so it turns out it was a temporary exhibition, and I didn't realize it. So the building itself is a glass circle, and there's a whole museology idea to the building itself, the architectural program, of the open museum, the interpenetration of community and museum, and so there's a whole zone of the museum that's completely open to the public. You can see 4 of the major works for free, even though they're inside the building, and there's a kind of constant interplay between inside and outside of the building, and I think this piece was extending that even a bit further and blurring the kind of vegetated boundary, whereas every photograph since that I've seen of it, it's a very hard glass circle. And this, I thought the architects did such a great job of taking that concept of the open museum and really even blurring the boundary of where the line between inside and outside enclosure is. Turns out it was the artist, not the architect. That museum has a James Turrell piece. They have an Mather piece, or not an mp4 piece. They also have a Patrick Blanc wall. And this piece, you can, if you've paid entry to the museum, you can walk through this corridor that punctures through the wall. If you haven't paid entrance to the museum, you can go on the opposite axis and sort of see the wall, but you can't walk through it. And so there's this kind of funny inside-outside perception of where you are, what's inside, what's outside. I probably should put a ground plan of the building because it's actually quite interesting where the courtyards are and how enclosed space moves through exterior space. So in both of these, the vegetation is in service of that blurring the boundary between inside and outside and helping you question your own spatial position. Am I in the museum or not right now? Briefly, to contextualize this a bit, because I don't actually sit around with a hydrotech manual all day and think about ballast. Why green roofs? Why green walls? What's the point of this in my own stuff? And I kind of situate my work between 3 ideas: the physical place, the cultural identity and ethics, and cultural production, and the way those 3 things relate to each other. This happens to be work from Iceland, but I've been thinking a lot recently about art production as something that looks at place, or let me say, art production that does look at place. Not all art production has to or does. But those art productions that do look at place, how are artists perceiving place, and how does that show up in their work of art? And how does that provide lessons for how landscape architects in particular, but also architects, the designers of places, how does that perception and conception of place help us do our work? That's a little bit confusing. I can make it even more confusing. What I do, and I'm not going to expect you to read it, I swear, it's really snappy on the screen. It's like pink and orange and funky. But the important thing to look at here is theorizing identity and making places. And there's a kind of gradient there of what I do, which is sometimes I'm theorizing identity, looking at how we theorize place. Sometimes I'm looking at how we make places and how those things relate to each other. And so the question that I want to ask or leave you with is, what is the role of the living environment in creating identity and in creating place? And how can we, as makers of cultural production, makers of physical place, help people see and care for and think about the place they're in? And I think that gets back to Beth Meyer and Liu Kwan talking about this persistent, perhaps secret adherence to places, and that defining the site is a creative act, and that it's not a given thing, it's not something you analyze and find, but it's the place you're operating is actually something you define for yourself. Where are you physically and where are you conceptually? And I'm open for questions for the next 15 minutes. Yeah.
Just wondering, this question popped into my head when you showed the topography and how it's that instance anyways, it was built out of house of styrofoam, and the idea that it's a green roof and that it's supposed to have something to do with sustainability usually in my mind, and then you're making a big mountain of styrofoam underneath this green thing, so it's green and it looks natural, but you have a pile of non-biodegradable stuff underneath it, or those hanging walls that are built out of these prefab PVC parts. And so it seems like there's this give and take that you get this green stuff, but you have to invest a bunch of, synthetic things that don't go away to get this really natural look. Do you think, does it balance? Or is it, you know what I mean? Are you putting more bad stuff into the building just to get the green stuff on the side of it, or not?
Yeah, I think that's a question that every designer has to answer for him or herself. I can't think of a single building material that doesn't have some environmental impact. And is the performance of the material over time offset by the embedded cost of the material up front and by embedded cost, environmental cost, embedded energy? Yeah, styrofoam's nasty. The production of styrofoam is really yucky. But it's also a really good insulator. There's a lot of what's called inverted roof construction, where you have the structure and then the waterproofing and then the insulation. And they've found that actually performs much better over time, but you've got to use rigid insulation, because otherwise it is going to get wet. So it's got to be something that can take getting wet. Styrofoam can handle being wet. When you're using it purely for form making as opposed to performance, you're pushing a boundary there, I think. And so the Chicago City Hall green room is a funny one where they are really using it strictly for form making. They want to make this kind of topography on the roof. The base layer is insulation, and everything over that is kind of gravy insulation. On the other hand, it's such a nice design, and it's such a great place to be that it's gotten a lot of attention and a lot of press, and it's prompted a lot of other people and institutions to make green roofs. So I think there's also a question of innovation and pushing the boundary so that a new technology becomes more accepted. But again, I think that's an ethical choice that every designer has to make for him or herself.
Are there alternatives that don't have, is there something that you can use that would work, that would be?
You can pile pumice. You can take the growth medium and lump it up and make those mounds. And,
then you have to invest in more structure.
Then you have to invest in the structure. So if you want the topographic character, then you're either going to be investing in styrofoam or in the structure. So, short answer, toss up. Am I allowed to say yeah as an answer?
Yeah, no, I raised the question.
And I think the important thing is to raise the question and to have it in your mind and not just sort of blindly say, great, I can make topography, woohoo! You have to say, is it appropriate to be doing this in this situation? I know the costs, environmental, social. Do the costs balance in terms of what I'm getting out of it?
I was driving down the highway out of Eugene and I saw that gas station with the green roof on it. And then you keep driving and you're thinking, what about all these weeds that are growing up through the cracks and on the side of the road? Why not just put gravel on the roof and see what grows? Or that? So I'm wondering, do these landscapes on the roofs have to be planted specifically with certain succulents and such, or can you just let the native grass seeds?
I think if you walk around Eugene, the answer is you can just let the native grass seeds pop up. There are a lot of unintended green roofs. I think it becomes a question of aesthetics, which is often, as a design professional, is often a question of what does your client want. And if you just wait for seeds, it's going to be 5 to 10 years before stuff really grows and flourishes. Whereas if you plant it, it's going to look good after 1 or 2 growing seasons. So there's the aesthetic question. There's the ecological question. In the case of the Oakland Public Library, where they've got that native prairie, that's intentionally connecting this building to its native landscape. So plant selection is very important when you have an ecological agenda. And oftentimes what gets deposited by wind or birds, as you know, is not the best stuff. So it's a question of aesthetics and client desire and ecological intent. Yeah.
You showed a little diagram flash by the building that you, it's just a little section of, you said they do it in Germany more, I don't know if you can go back to it all, but could you explain that a little bit more, how that works? It has a tree kind of coming up in the back.
Triple bottom line.
Yeah, that one, yep.
Yeah, basically, excess water from the plants drains into a storage cistern, but then gets pumped up and recirculated, and that keeps the green facade damp. And as you know from trying to clean a counter, damp things pick up dirt better than dry things do. So if you damp the growth fabric, the building felt, it'll do a better job of filtering out particulates. There's also a fan inside it that draws air through the green wall and pushes it into the building. So you're forcing air through a damp, living, humidified green filter. And basically the water the plant leaves help to trap particulates, and then the leaves themselves add oxygen to the air, and they also cool the air. So this is a really good technique for pre-cooling air as it comes into a building. Obviously not so great in winter if you're going to bring in cold, damp air, but really good in summer. Yeah.
With these filtration systems, does that building felt have to be replaced? Does the filter fill up when it's not filtered?
The idea actually is, and I realized as I said that I misspoke, and I hope nobody would catch it, so you're too smart, but thank you. The idea actually is the plants themselves trap it, and that as the water filters over the plants, that helps continually wash the leaves and also damps them so that more material sticks to them. Thank you for keeping me honest.
So you mentioned in passing also that your own house and usually put a green roof on. So that, I mean, obviously, and one of the comments you also made was if more people were doing it, then the whole total cost would come down. Is there a kind of DIY green roof movement going on for residences? I mean, why is it so expensive? Icelandic farmers have been doing it for the last 1,000
years.
1,000 years. Is there a reason why?
Let's see, well there's Iceland, and basically you pack a piece of dirt and stick it on your building, and your building is like 3 feet thick anyway, and you're basically living within the earth there, and it's cold and dirty and smelly, and there's a lot of aesthetic reasons that we're not doing it like that anymore. Green roofs are really expensive, and basically it's that, if I go back to this section, you have to pay for this and everything underneath it. That waterproofs your building, you're done, walk away. Everything over that is an additional cost. And I am ashamed to admit how much we spent on the drainage layer, but I can do a quick calculation for you. We have about, let's see if it's, we have about 600 square feet of green roof on the house, and it was $1,200 for the drainage layer, so that's $2 a square foot. It was $800 for the growth medium, so that's $1 and change, $1.25 a square foot. And we did a lot of cuttings, and they're the cheapest you can get, $500 in plants. And that's just sedums, just cuttings and plugs, and that's no bulbs and grasses and perennials, and so I don't know, I don't want to do the math, but it winds up being a lot per square foot for something that is not required. You have no real need for it other than, you know, I've got this ethic. It does improve stormwater, and so that's why this. So I've got a great memo for a bank if you want it about, you know, it becomes life cycle cost. It becomes, what do they call it? Systems development fees when you get a permit. You can get those reduced if you are doing something that's not impacting the sewer system. Stormwater fees monthly get knocked down. That's like $15 a month. That'll take me about 100 months to get repayment on my room. So, you know, it's 8 years, fine. It'll pay for itself. So it does really become a long-term investment and an equity. They do pay for themselves eventually, but if you're a developer, there's no reason to do it. And that's why you see things like the city of Chicago on all their institutional buildings is doing it, because they're going to own that building for the long term. So people who are building their own homes and plan on living it for 10 years or more, it pays back. Institutional, government, universities, it pays for itself. Developer, all cost, no benefit. So I think you are seeing more homeowners doing it, but still really not in the developer realm. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Kind of. Yeah.
On the project over the parking garage, was that largely grass that would actually be occupied, or is it, besides the putting green, is it, and is it grass roof that can be occupied in intensive roof and therefore a lot deeper, or?
A grass roof, a lawn roof is actually kind of funny because it's somewhere between. You can do it in like 6 to 8 inches, so technically it's considered an extensive green roof, but it does require, if you plan to have people out there, it requires irrigation and mowing because grasses can't go through a drought. So this whole thing has an irrigation system underneath it, which again is crazy. I water my roof. But the idea here is very much that in Philadelphia, there's a tradition of urban squares with high-rise towers around them. So this is very much in the tradition of Philadelphia development, but that's meant as a public amenity. This is, I don't think they've opened yet when they took this photograph, which is why you don't see anybody on the lawn, but it's meant as public amenity space.
And how much does the lawn weigh in comparison to like 4 cars? Is it, you know, just for?
It's got to be a lot less. It's 6 pounds per inch of depth per square foot. So if you're looking at, this was typically an 8-inch profile, so you can do that math, 48 pounds per square foot. And I think that's significantly under the dead load of a car. And then, you know, your structural engineer adds in the live load of people and dogs and whatnot. Snow in Philadelphia. Yeah.
Are there long-term effects of like using trees on green roofs and the roots maybe like penetrating some of the foot fabric or drainage board or structure?
PVC roofs are inherently root resistant or roots can't get through. If you're using an EPDM or other types of roofs, you typically do a root barrier, which is copper impregnated fabric. The roots hit it and go, yeah! Let me go out instead of down. So you do have to protect the roof from roots, but you have to protect the roof from roots. You protect it from all plants, not just trees. The funky thing with trees that we found here, it's on the Delaware River. You get some pretty intense wind there, and they're high-rise buildings, so you get some intense wind between them. You have to worry about uplift on the trees. So you actually, when you first plant the tree, you can do a mesh system, or you can do crisscrossing cables, and you actually bolt it into the roof structure, so that when the wind blows, the tree stays where it is. And eventually their root system gets strong enough. Most of those systems are meant to rust and degrade over time. Once the root system gets strong enough, the tree holds itself in place. But when they're just planted, a storm comes along, it's going to knock them all out. And actually, that's one of the benefits of green roofs is if you're using gravel ballast on a roof, that can get blown away, and the green roof helps hold the ballast in place.
Are there more area examples of green roofs that require watering? It's a question of plant choice.
The great thing about sedums, they've done stress tests in Germany. They can go 3 months without water. They basically go dormant. They stop growing outwards. They keep their kind of fleshy green appearance. But 3 months no water. So they're a pretty good choice for, say, Oregon, where we get no water all summer. And there's a group of people at Oregon State University doing irrigation regimes on native plants and seeing when you don't water a roof, how long do the native plants last if you water once a week, twice a week, once every other week. So they're doing various testings on them. And what they're finding is the native plants, if you're a landscape architect, this makes perfect sense, the native plants go dormant in the summer, which is fine for the plants. It's not fine for the client who is looking out at a brown roof instead of a green roof. And then, the rain comes and it brings up again, but it's not the aesthetic that they pay for. So the best choice in arid climates, and I would say that come summer, ours is pretty arid, tend to be sedums. And Ed Snodgrass I can't remember the name of his farm. His comment is, we were asking him about native plants and why doesn't he have natives? Why is he all sedums? And he said, it's not a native environment. It's hotter, it's drier, it's a thinner soil profile, there's no water table. It's not a native environment. So why would you use native plants in a non-native environment? And he basically subscribes to the mutant ecology school of thought, which is that when there are these non-native environments that you've created through technical intervention to just go on with it. Yeah.
I'm interested to know how you coordinated the installation of this green roof with the contractor to ensure that it was properly designed and installed.
One of the most important things about green roofs is to get everybody on board from the beginning. So we were lucky on this project. WRT, where I worked, does architecture and landscape architecture. So I was working on the architectural team, and I was also the landscape architectural designer. So I actually was the person sitting in the early meetings with the structural engineer saying, ooh, wait a minute, we've got 3 feet of soil there, because I knew where I wanted to put trees. But if you don't have that person, then you've got to have the landscape architect at the meeting with the architect and the structural engineer to make sure that it's designed properly. And then, come installation, the funky thing here were the bolts for the trees. And so, at a certain level, it's pretty straightforward. You put down the waterproofing, make sure it's sealed. You do a flood test, so you put 6 inches of water on the roof, let it stand, make sure it doesn't leak, and then put down what they call the overburden green roof. Not too complicated. You want somebody who knows what they're doing on hand. I've seen contractors blow in growth medium, and you carefully lay down the drainage board, and you wrap the filter fabric up the side so that the growth medium doesn't get into the drainage board. And they come in with the blower and just like, and you watch literally filter fabric get blown off the building. And you've got to say, stop, turn it off. Gotta back up. So you've got to have somebody on hand to watch and make sure it's being done properly. And for us, the real critical thing was we were bolting through the PVC membrane, and then we had to seal, liquid seal around it to make sure that that connection was watertight. And that was the one thing that we were really, really cautious with our contractor about. So you have to know what the potential weak points are and make sure that you're on hand on those days.
With the green roofs and the green walls, when you said dormant, it made me wonder how well they function if the plants go dormant, and is that an argument for using exotic plants versus native plants? Especially if it's performing this filtration function, the plants more.
If they're getting water, then they're not going to go dormant. So the kind of stormwater quality, filtration, detention function is still going to happen because the plants will be growing at that point in time. They also have their root network in the growth medium, and a large part of the filtration slowing happens through the roots, not through the leaves. So even when they're dormant, they're still providing some functionality. Other things like, if it's not damp, the insulative properties aren't as good. And if the plants are dormant, then the air tumbling isn't happening. So I do think some of those building energy performance benefits have to have the green part of the green roof. They can't just be the dirt and the roots. And yeah, I do think that that's a check in favor of plants like sedums. And there are native sedums.
In your experience, when a client comes to you or comes to a firm and says, I'd like to do a green roof, do they want to do a green roof more for the aesthetic value or more for the practical
was we had a developer come to us saying they wanted a green roof, and basically they'd already blown through 3 other architects. We're like, that's bad side. And they were committed to high-rise development. They had penciled it out, and that was the way they were going to make the most money. Because of the site, that meant they had to have a parking garage. And we proposed 3 different options for them. Sort of tower with townhouses around it, so you got more of a village character. I don't even remember what the second one was. And then this third one of the high rises around a terrace parking garage with green roof on top. And I think they decided in this case that the amenity of the park and the resonance with Philadelphia development patterns totally outweighed the green roof. That said, then we went back to them with these like great planting plants and stuff, and they were like, it's too expensive. Get rid of 3/4 of those fancy plants. Let's just do lawn. So there's as much lawn as there is because of the development side of things. So it totally depends on the client. Some people come to you with an ethic. Some people come to you because they think it makes sense financially.
I think we should probably wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Rob.